Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us get started on this first session in the afternoon. You know me.
Ya me conocen, soy Hans Christensen de la OCDE y tengo la tarea de moderar la sesión que sigue esta deliciosa comida. El tema es la evaluación, el monitoreo, la gestión de las empresas públicas y tenemos a un panel muy distinguido y diverso que nos hablará sobre este tema. Yo diría con diversidad porque hay 2 representantes de autoridades públicas, de empresas públicas y algunos que representan organizaciones internacionales. Y esto también significa que tenemos limitantes de tiempo. Entonces vamos a comenzar directamente con el tema y quisiera presentar a los analistas brevemente. Primero le pediré al doctor Han-Jun Park, que es el jefe de investigación de evaluación SOE del Instituto de Finanzas Públicas de Corea. Después Shunitsa Kikeri, que es el director del programa para el gobierno corporativo del Banco Mundial. Y luego es un honor presentar a José Antonio González Anaya, que es el director general de Petróleos Mexicanos.
Mr. Andres Soneto Lafay, who is kind of principal executive at the CAF, the Latin American Development Bank. And finally, there is Mrs. Patricia Elliott Blas, who is the chief executive officer of FONAFRO, the ownership agency in Peru. And without further ado, I would like to give the word to Dr. Park for a first presentation.
Thank you, Chair. It is my honor to take advantage of this opportunity to share what we have done in the 8th Asia SOE Network Seminar today. Probably many of you didn't know much about the Asia network, but it was convened in the last year, end of the last year in the Hanoi, and we talked about the revised OECD SOE guidelines, and also talk about the performance evaluation for state-owned enterprise. So, as you know, performance evaluation is often emphasized since underperformance of state-owned enterprises has been a critical issue in many countries. Sometimes scholars and many policymakers ascribe such underperformance to the insufficient oversight and poorly attributed accountability. So probably the way to solve this kind of problem would be to regularly evaluate the performance of the state-owned enterprises. However, the effectiveness of the public enterprise, effectiveness of the performance evaluation may be varied depending on the quality and structure of the performance evaluation. The next 2 slides introduce some details of the Asia SOE network, but you may find the detailed information on the OECD website, so I'm going to skip this too. Yes. It shows what I described just right before. So, what we have discussed in the last year's Asian Network Seminar, we talk about the performance evaluation. For the last year's network seminar, OECD Secretariat examined 11 countries with a survey instrument developed by KIPF in cooperation with the OECD Secretariat. Thanks to their effort and great job, we summarized something which we found our observation from the survey. The survey found that really all Asian countries have some kind of the performance evaluation system for SOE in place. For most of countries institutionalized the performance evaluation systems by now. And also, in most countries, the government authority use the evaluation result to change executive remunerations. There are some differences in terms of the remunerations, but in the morning session, you may heard about the Philippine cases, other countries' cases. So you find that too. But the problem is the OECD guidelines would generally call for SOE's respective board board to supervise the management. But the thing is that the respective role of the state ownership entity, corporate board, and the executive management are already clearly delineated in the Asian countries forbade. That's the current landscape of the Asian performance evaluation system. In order to give you some more detailed information, I summarized some characteristics of the performance management system in Asian regions. Among the countries that have adopted the performance evaluation systems, all of them evaluate financial performance through quantitative indicators. For example, SOE's yearly net income and economic value, labor productivity. And the interesting thing is a smaller group of countries also use qualitative indicators to measure financial performance too. So if I give you some examples, information, it is about information on the quality of SOE's risk management system, something like that. If you read the booklet inserted in your packet on the table, you may find more detailed information. So the booklet provides you some kind of the 2x2 matrix which divided by whether the indicator is for financial information performance or the non-financial performance, or the other dimension is about the quantitative or the qualitative. So there are various kinds of the indicators utilized to evaluate the performance of SOEs in the Asian regions. The stock taking of the national practices pointed to two main methods which have been used to formalize the performance evaluation process and thus improve its effectiveness. The first one is performance contract, something like MOU system, and the second system is the performance indicators. So all countries undertake performance evaluation against quantitative indicators measuring both financial and non-financial performance in Asian regions. The other nature of the performance management system in Asian regions, in almost all of the countries with the performance evaluation system in place, the result have some degree of influence on the level of executive remunerations within individual state-owned enterprises. In smaller group of the countries, furthermore, performance evaluation also affect executive reappointment of dismissal decisions. Those systems is utilized in Bhutan, China, Kazakhstan, and Korea. Also, we also heard in the morning session the Philippines also use the information to reappointment at the level of the board members. That's the general characteristics of the performance evaluation systems in Asian regions. Maybe I think you may expect similar things from the Asian regions. Conclusions, implications way forward. Many countries in Asia have adopted structured systems, performance evaluation upon defining key performance indicators, in some cases linking state-owned enterprise performance outcomes to the executive remuneration and incentives. The thing is that the next steps, actually in most countries in Asian regions, they already adopted the performance evaluation system. But the thing is that the most important thing is to differentiate the quality of the level of the quality of the performance evaluation system depends on the quality of indicators measurement, how to measure the indicators, and the internal integration and the linkage between the organizational performance and the inter-employers performance. Those things are also differentiated the quality of performance evaluation system. So although I think, although many of countries, although they adopted the information, the performance evaluation system, the most important thing is how to utilize the performance evaluation system, so that how to develop the indicators, those things are the next things we have to consider to improve the performance evaluation. So that's all I would like to summarize for the key result from the 8th ASEAN SOE network seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. Admirably succinct, and I certainly congratulate our Asian colleagues with taking a good hard look at the non-financial indicators, because in our European member countries, they would normally admit that that is a very weak point, except where government subsidies may be involved. I would now give the floor to Sunita Kikeri from the World Bank, whom I understand will tell us something about what they're to do about this.
Thank you very much, Hans. And it's really a great pleasure to be here in Mexico City with all of you. I was asked today to present a recent toolkit that the World Bank has done on the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises, and then from that toolkit to see what lessons have we learned or can we derive for performance management systems in particular. So just to give you a quick outline, I'll give you a brief overview about the objectives and approach of the toolkit, sort of what is in the toolkit itself, what is the main chapters of it, how have we used it, and what lessons have we derived in terms of the SOE performance management systems. So in terms of the toolkit, you know, the reason why we decided to do this is that we have been getting so much demand from our client countries for the need for reforming their state-owned enterprises. And a lot of that has been driven by the need to improve the performance and the delivery of critical services. Throughout the morning, we've heard that SOEs are concentrated largely in the main sectors of the economy. There's also been a big fiscal and financial driver where SOEs who have underperformed and who have been a drain on the budget have been now, the governments want to try and impose financial and fiscal discipline and bring the budget under control. In many cases, because of the budgetary problems, SOEs are no longer being directly funded by the government, so there's a lot of pressure on the companies themselves to seek alternative sources of financing from the capital markets and from other sources. And of course, there's been a big pressure on companies to become much more transparent and accountable because they're, at the end of the day, holders of publicly owned resources. Now, combined with those drivers, we've also seen that there is a growing recognition that corporate governance is actually one of the key factors in creating underperformance. In the past, a lot of it had focused on operational matters, on financial restructuring, and so on and so forth. But in the last several years, and thanks in large part to the work of the OECD and the issuance of the OECD guidelines in 2005, that has really generated the knowledge and the understanding that corporate governance is one of the key factors that really inhibits the performance of the firms. And I'm sure this list is not surprising to any one of you if you had to really name what are some of the key problems that are commonly seen across all countries that we have worked in, is the problem of having multiple and conflicting objectives. And we've talked about that this morning when it comes to the commercial and non-commercial objectives. The fact that many of these companies in the past have enjoyed soft budget constraints. Their boards and management have been politicized, and in fact, even to this day, this is one of the most difficult aspects of addressing the governance and improving the governance in these companies. We saw in the presentations this morning how SOEs sometimes don't have any clear owner because there are multiple agencies, 10 agencies, 15 agencies that are involved in one way or another, and even where there are state shareholders, often there's been a lack of capacity and a weakness there to exercise the shareholder rights. In most cases, we have seen that performance monitoring systems, even though they're in practice, they're there in design and practice, they have found it very difficult to make that work. And there have been serious challenges in financial reporting and disclosure. And now coming more and more on the agenda is how do we use corporate governance as a tool to address integrity, as we discussed this morning, and issues of corruption. So I think there's really a big consensus now that governance is one of the key drivers that needs to be addressed. Now, the reason that we did this toolkit was because even though the general principles and standards are known, we found that in many of the client countries that we work with, there is really a demand for the knowledge and practical tools and for implementation support. So what we did was to try and pull together the international good practice based on the standards and guidelines developed by the OECD. We tried to see, well, what are the reform options and approaches that are out there in order to help countries to move along this reform process. What are some of the lessons learned from countries who have been reforming SOEs for a long time? What can we learn from their experience? What are some of the practical solutions? And then what are some of the tools for implementation? And so this is what we tried to pull together in this toolkit. Now, the goal, basically, of the toolkit is to help practitioners to design and implement these reforms based on the international guidelines and standards. Our focus was very much on commercial SOEs, predominantly at the national level, even though many of the approaches would apply to the municipal and local levels. We really concentrated at the national level commercial SOEs, and we focused on companies with significant ownership and control. Our audience for the toolkit was government officials, the SOEs themselves, practitioners, and other stakeholders. This was a toolkit, an initiative of the World Bank Group as a whole. So it was led by the finance and markets practice, where I am, and by the governance practice, where Arturo Herrera is from, the practice manager. And we did this in close collaboration with IFC. So this really does represent the efforts of all the different parts of the World Bank Group that have historically dealt with state-owned enterprises. And it was financed by the World Bank, by the IFC, through the Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management, and by a Global Partnership Trust Facility Trust Fund. Now, the toolkit itself consists of 9 key chapters. And the first one really just provides a basic context and overview for why this issue has come on the agenda and sort of what is the state of play in SOEs in the different regions and countries in the world. And then the core, chapters 2 to 8 really are the core pillars or the core areas of corporate governance. So first of all is the legal and regulatory framework, which is the very foundation for good corporate governance. And in that chapter, we do talk about the shortcomings in terms of SOE laws and regulations, the need to develop these frameworks and put together a proper ownership framework in place, whether it is in the form of a law or a regulation, whether it's in the form of an ownership policy. So that whole first chapter really describes what should be an ideal legal and regulatory framework and how can governments develop that framework given their own local circumstances. Then the next key chapter is on the state ownership arrangements and very much reflects the discussion that we had this morning in terms of the different models of state ownership, very much in line with what Hans was presenting, and then what are some of the challenges in separating the ownership role from the policymaking and the regulatory role, and then how do you move along that spectrum from a decentralized system to a fully centralized system. And I think this is one of the most complex and challenging parts of the whole framework of corporate governance of SOEs because of all the vested interests that are at stake, because of the resistance from the line ministries. We have found that this is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a simple stroke of the pen to create a new centralized ownership entity. And in fact, what we try to do is to see within that particular context, if full centralization is not feasible, then what are the other approaches that are there for the existing framework to become more professional and to become more focused on exercising the ownership right. So this has been a very challenging area, and I think we're making steady progress here. But we're seeing that more and more there is this trend towards centralization, but at the same time, we're also working closely with countries where they want to strengthen the existing units rather than create new units. And sometimes the rationale for creating that new unit can be a very difficult thing to sell. So related to the state ownership framework, of course, is the performance monitoring system, and that's what this session is about. Chapter 5 is all about the financial and fiscal discipline, and specifically focusing on creating a level playing field and making sure that SOEs are operating on the same financial footing as private companies, and if and where there is government support, then that should be made fully transparent, especially when it comes to the non-commercial objectives or the public sector obligations. This is also quite a challenging area because we find that even where governments have defined those obligations, really getting them to identify them and then finance them, that has been the trickiest part of the problem. So how do you really try and separate those obligations from the regular commercial business of the company is also quite a big challenge. Chapter 6 looks at all the issues related to the board of directors, and I think this was touched upon this morning when there was some discussion about the nominations policy. I think the fundamental problem that we see across all countries, and there has been significant improvement over these past couple of years, is in the composition of the boards and the way in which the board of directors is structured. And many of those problems arise from the fact that there is no clear framework in place for how to nominate and appoint board members. So we've seen in countries where board members are handpicked by the president without any single definition of what criteria are needed, without any structure or process there in place. And I think the same issue also arises when the board selects a CEO. In many countries, in fact, we have seen that the CEO is also directly appointed by the president. So how do you ensure that the CEO's appointment is delegated to a professionally composed board is one of the key issues that we've been dealing with a lot in there. And then once we get to the composition of the boards, then it's about how do you make the board a professionally functioning organ, as it is the central organ in the governance of the company. How do you make sure that there are proper board committees in place, that the board attendance is good, the board remuneration, evaluation issues, all the issues that were touched upon this morning. Transparency, disclosure, and controls is on Chapter 7, and in there we cover all the key issues in that, followed by the protection of minority shareholder rights, which is the 8th chapter. And finally, the 9th chapter is really more about the implementation side. And here I think, we've found that we can diagnose what problem is, and in many countries we're helping governments do that. But the real challenge in this whole area is one of implementation. And I think this is where the rubber hits the road, because at the end of the day, this is a deeply political process, and it's a very contentious process to let control go and to really, for the state as an owner to exercise its rights just on the core ownership rights without being able to give instructions to the companies or without being able to give direction and interfere in the operations, very tough to do. So we found that in all of this corporate governance that there is really, at the end of the day, while there are the standards and guidelines and principles, in implementation, there is no one-size-fits-all. And this is a journey that can be quite a long-term journey that goes sometimes one step forward, 2 steps back. But as long as people are moving, or the clients are moving in the right direction, I think that is what is fundamentally one of the key issues. We've seen that even in the case of India, actually we had done a diagnostic report of corporate governance of state enterprises in India. And when you look and see, the process started in the early to mid-1990s. And to this day, they are fine-tuning and improving the system as and when companies improve their own performance, as and how the government becomes a better shareholder. So this requires, at the end of the day, commitment from the top. Without the political support and commitment, we see that this is almost impossible to have really meaningful reform. There's a lot of paper and policies that are put in place, but in practice, it's a different story. It also requires that there be capacity built on the side of the ownership entity to be able to carry out these reforms, that there is also public awareness and public consultation and, educating the public to build public support for these reforms. I mean, these are some of the biggest jewels in the crown in many of the countries, and changing that culture and changing the behavior and changing mindset can be very, very difficult indeed. And finally, just to wrap up, I think the last point I would like to make on the corporate governance side is that even though corporate governance is central to this process, we continue to feel that there are other reforms that also need to take place. So one has to think about the broad policy environment in which companies are working. So, opening the entry barriers, removing exit barriers, making sure that there are proper regulatory mechanisms in place, and at the same time also having proper sector regulations in place. So let me end there, and I'm happy to speak on the performance monitoring issues at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kike. And I think that now we have heard the general. So now let's go to the specific from the chief executive officer from the largest state-owned enterprise here in Mexico. So, Mr. Gonzalez-Anaya, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for letting me speak here. I want to thank the Ministry of Finance for the invitation to come to this forum, and in particular Max Diener, the Chief Counsel for the Ministry of Finance. I don't have a presentation to present, but I can try to tell you some stories about why this is so difficult. When I arrived here at the Ministry of Finance 15 years ago, perhaps a bit less, one of the first tasks that we were asked to work on, we were in the finance area, was to write a new stock market law. It was at the Sarbanes-Oxley time, when Enron had gone crazy, and there were all of these legislations passed to improve corporate governance, corporate transparency, performance, etc., in the private sector. And we dedicated ourselves to write a new stock market law, which is still in place in Mexico. And it was a very hard and difficult process. I remember spending countless hours with corporate lawyers in Mexico, negotiating, and I am not exaggerating, it took us about 3 months to get over the definitions article. So that means it took us 3 months to write 2 articles of legislation. The legislation is 450 articles long. It didn't take that long to write the other ones. But then, for the next 3 months, we finally made it through the first 30 articles of legislation. And these were the hardest to write. Afterwards, in about 2 or 3 months' time, we finished writing the rest of the 420 articles. So the moral of the story is that corporate governance and performance indicators anywhere is hard. But when you try to do this in a state-owned enterprise, then it becomes very, very difficult, because you are trying to put, to use a cliche, a box in a, a square in a circle. It becomes very, very hard to do. To do this, some of the reasons were highlighted by the previous presentation in the World Bank. The objectives aren't clear. You have sub-budget constraints, politics, multiple agencies, monitoring, etc. So it really becomes a very difficult task to try to have great or world-class corporate governance standards in state-owned enterprises, because it's hard to have corporate world standards for corporate governance in private companies, where the market imposes an incredible amount of discipline into the performance of these firms. So we ask ourselves, we go back to the age-old questions, well, why do we have SOEs anyway? If we have an SOE, there must be some reason for which, the government, the legislature, whatever you want to call it, decided not to leave that task to the private sector. And there's a reason for that. For the case of Pemex, the reason was obvious. It was a desire to keep and to control the oil resources, all the resources that were on the ground. So for very many years, Pemex, for over 75 years, Pemex was a state-owned enterprise that had gradual reforms throughout these 79 years. But then it was not subject, it was, the reason for its existence was that nobody else could come and extract, produce, refine, or process oil or its derivatives. So the only company that could do oil-related business in Mexico was Pemex. With the reform that this administration, that President Peña Nieto's administration did, in which he opened the sector to competition just 2.5 years ago, as they say, the whole ball game changes. Pemex is all of a sudden not the only player in town. There can be other companies that can, explore, extract, process, refine, transport, or distribute oil or any of its derivatives. So along with this very deep structural reform, there had to be a very deep transformation of the corporate governance of the state-owned enterprise. The decision was made to open the oil sector, the oil and gas sector, to the private sector, but it was also decided to keep the company as a public state-owned enterprise. So I didn't participate in the reform, but I know that people looked at the best corporate governance practices to try to have the best corporate governance that the company could have, given that it's a state-owned enterprise, and given, I am sure, some political restrictions in the process in which this was made. So today, I can say that we have a board that is a very functional board. It's, there are 10 members. State-owned enterprises, typical state-owned enterprises have boards that are really, really large. So now it's only 10 members. So that's a reasonably sized board. 5 of these board members are independent. And there was a definition of independence. It basically meant that they could not have any conflict of interest. They were approved by the Senate. So they were proposed by the executive and they were approved by the Senate. So that gives the corporate board of Pemex kind of the things that we were thinking about when we were thinking about stock market companies that were going to be listed in the Mexican stock market. But even though we have a board that works like that, it becomes very difficult because Pemex has had, as was said in the previous presentation, tons of mandates, or it inherited tons of mandates. So the objectives by law in the energy reform were that Pemex has to be a productive enterprise of the state. And to me, this means that we have to be 2 things. One is a profitable company, and 2, since we're a state-owned enterprise, we have to contribute to the development of the country. And these 2 objectives, I think, are complementary. I don't think they're substitutes. But you still have a long way to go. You have a good board, you have a clear mandate, but then you have to change the entire remuneration structure. You have to change the entire incentive structure for the firm, and these things take a long time. So, to try to end my report and my babbling, it's a very difficult thing to do, to try to have a state-owned enterprise run like a well-run, world-class standard corporate governance company. If you wanted to do that, why don't you just make it a private company and list it in the New York Stock Exchange, and that's the end of it, right? There is a reason for why you have state-owned enterprises, and we should try to make these things work, because there is the origin of Pemex is such that it mandates us to, for now, be a company that is profitable, that extracts and processes oil efficiently, and at the same time promotes the development of the oil and gas sector, and the energy sector more broadly in Mexico, and therefore its development. So at the end of the day, we are looking to all of these, and I'm going to get a copy of the World Bank toolkit. I'm sure they used it for the reform, but I'm going to get a copy of the toolkit and see what kinds of things can help us to improve the performance of these state-owned enterprises in an environment where, by definition, we are not subjected, to all of the other pressures that a private enterprise is subjected to. With that, I will end, and thank you very much for my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gonzalez, and for this spirited and interesting presentation. Actually, and thanks for telling us about the boards, and congratulations with the progress you have made. Actually, I was co-author of a report on Pemex 4 or 5 years ago, and we did actually write in the executive summary that if this is to be a world-class oil company, then it needs world-class corporate governance. And you have suddenly made significant steps in that direction. But I think that is the cue to the next speaker, Mr. Oneto Lafay, whom I understand will tell us more about the importance of boards in this context.
Thank you, Hans. Because I am representing a Latin American Development Bank, and this study was made for Latin American countries, I will do my presentation in Spanish. El año pasado, CAF, en la reunión de la Red Latinoamericana de Gobierno Corporativo para Empresas del Estado,
Enterprises, activity that we've done with the World Bank, they presented a study on transparency of corporate governance practices at the level of state-owned enterprises, and we developed an index based on public information that state-owned enterprises shown on their websites. We reviewed over 100 companies in 19 countries, and we found out that precisely talking about the directors' index was pretty low. Companies were not presenting information on how the boards are selected or their roles, and we thought it was relevant to work on this subject deeply, not solely based on public information, but rather reviewing it in detail. And that's what I'm presenting here today. The objective of this study is to analyze effectiveness and structure on SOEs, boards of directors in CAF member states. That's basically South American states and several of Central America and Mexico, in order to generate public policy recommendations and to identify the best practices of the companies that reported via the survey we made, and to therefore generate a reproducibility effect. We developed a 45-question questionnaire that was sent to member enterprises and to other state-owned enterprises CAF has relationship with. The subjects we dealt with were several, such as the profile of directors, the role of directors, committees, evaluation, remuneration, training, initial training. These were the subjects that were evaluated with this questionnaire, and the idea was that it had to be voluntary and the information needed to be anonymous in terms of results. The idea is to have no reference to individual companies, but rather for this to be added information. The work was developed by CAF and by governance consultants. Their main partner, Andrés Bernal, was present at the previous session, and together with CAF, we worked on this document. And just to give you a general idea of what we received in terms of information, 33 companies answered the questionnaire from 9 countries, and at the level of countries we received more answers from Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Colombia and Peru being some of the most active countries in this subject. And from Mexico we haven't received many, so Pemex did answer back. So we would like to have a larger sample because Mexico is an important country for the region and for us. The importance of state-owned enterprises here is very important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Brazil is also a country that we are missing. And for the second stage, we hope we can have 50 enterprises integrating enterprises from the previously mentioned countries of Latin America, since we had to do a first cut for this meeting. And in terms of what we saw, we realized that there's a concentration of public enterprises in sector, energy, and public services. In previous meetings, we've already talked about how relevant these sectors are. At the level of enterprise profile, we find that 2/3 of the enterprises have a property structure where the state is 100% shareholder, and the rest have shares between 51 and 99%, and most of the companies have the state as a shareholder at the central bank level, and the rest are prefectures or provinces or at the municipal level, and they are the shareholders. And only 22% out of these 33 enterprises that answered back are publicly listed. So we find a concentration at the level of the central government and at the level of closed, non-listed enterprises. We like this chart in terms of findings, and it talks about operations of directors in terms of how frequently directors get together and how long their meetings last. And what we see on the chart is that the first two bars concentrate 48% of the enterprises that answered, and they have monthly or bi-weekly meetings, and they last from 3 to 4 hours. And on the other side, we have 21% with bi-monthly or quarterly meetings. And we're talking about large companies. This is not a family-owned, mid-sized company where a meeting can take place every 2 or 3 months. We're talking about public, state-owned enterprises where meetings should take place every month and they should last for 4 hours. So what we understand from both sides is that on the one hand, the director is doing management roles, because if they are having meetings every week, every 2 weeks, for 3 or 4 hours, they're doing something else and just talking about management follow-up. And on the other extreme, we have very few meetings and they're not spending enough time on meetings. So they are letting management perform activities without them complying with this role they should perform. So I believe the results were pretty interesting, and they let us know how directors should operate. On the other hand, when we look at committees, and there was 3/4 of the enterprises report having a board. The most reported board is the audit one, with 69%. Corporate governance, only 28% report having this corporate governance committee. Financial companies, all of them report a risk committee. Why? Because the regulating body demands this from them. And the most important thing here is that we can see that almost 80% of the committees state that their role is decision-making one. It's not only consultation, so they play a very important role in the decision-making process. And we have to find out if they have the profile and if they are being properly trained to make these decisions. When we look at initial training and training in general, we find out that 1/3 of the enterprises that answer the questionnaire don't have this initial training. 50% do it, most of them do it, and it's regulated. And there is another group that does it even if they don't have it as part of the regulations. And they deal with subjects such as the business as such, growth perspectives of the sector where the company is, corporate documents, and the role of the board, and that is in terms of initial training. Now, talking about formal training, what we find is that there are fewer companies that provide training, and among those that do, there is a large group that does so because they feel like it, but not because it's regulated. And the areas evaluated refer to the business strategy, corporate governance, that's important, to analyze risks and controls, and very little referring to accounting policies. And we saw that on the previous slide. The main committee is the audit committee, so it will be very important for directors who are part of the committee to have this knowledge. And sadly enough, I don't have the slide on me, but I will present this tomorrow in the next session. The profile of directors is not necessarily a professional profile. It's rather a profile related to the public position of public officers, and that's why they're present at the board. So it's very important to train directors in subjects they will be working on in committees, and they also have this decision-making role. And the last slide refers to evaluation. And we see with great satisfaction that 2/3 of public companies evaluate their directors, and they do so mainly using the self-assessment methodology that the representative of Philippines mentioned before, these peer self-assessments. But 55% of the companies also use outsourcing companies, so they guide them and help them in these evaluation processes. And these are annual evaluations. However, what we also find is that this information is not fully used because just 1/3 of the enterprises use the information of the evaluation as input for their director nomination process, and this has to do with how directors are selected. There are few independent directors, and most of them make it because the public position they want to have forces them to be board members. So it's hard to evaluate you because they need to be there unless they stop being officers. These are the basic results of the survey. Tomorrow, I will give you a presentation more focused on subjects that are of interest for owners or ownership representatives, about processes and the role of directors at the enterprises. And just as conclusion, I would like to say that this is just a general overview of what we found. We find that many enterprises are doing a great job, but there is another group that should refer to these other enterprises in order to reach their level. And statistics seem interesting and robust enough to know what's going on in the region and to generate public policies that help us improve the effectiveness of directors. So once again, all of the enterprises present here who haven't answered our survey, I recommend you to please reach us to answer the survey. Once again, this is confidential information. There's no individual reference to anyone. And the more information we have, we will have a better reference and we will be able to give better recommendations. I thank all of the companies present here who answered the survey, because thanks to them we have these results. In case you're interested, my email address is on the screen, and the website you see on the screen has the study that I've just referred to. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Andrés. Y vuelva.
When we were discussing this study that Dr. Park referred to in Asia, there was one dissenting voice among all these people who agreed that performance management and a rigorous structure was an excellent idea. That dissenter was Singapore, who kept saying that, look, why would you do a top-down performance evaluation? That's for the boards to do. And at least you seem to be saying, Andres, that in some cases the boards are simply not up to the job. But let us now hear from a real practitioner, again, what then happens in practice. So, Mrs. Sylvia Blas, you have the floor.
Bueno, buenas tardes con todos. Gracias a los organizadores de este evento por la invitación. Bueno, yo vengo de Perú, de la corporación FONAFE.
From FONAFE.
Primero quisiera comenzar.
And first I would like to explain a little bit about the role of this enterprise. The model we have in Peru is the centralized model, the one we've heard about during most of these sessions. FONAFE is the enterprise, is the holding of state-owned enterprises in Peru. The main role of FONAFE is to regulate and manage state-owned enterprises, to manage the profit of state-owned enterprises. FONAFE approves the consolidated budget of enterprises. It also appoints directors for these enterprises, and that's part of the main roles of FONAFE. The Board of Directors of FONAFE is comprised by 5 ministries. I just wrote 4. It's presided by the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Energy, Transportation, Housing, and the Prime Minister. We coordinate 34 state-owned enterprises at a national level. In FONAFE, we don't have regional or local government enterprises. The only national enterprise that's not in FONAFE is Petroperú. That's the oil enterprise in the country. Out of these 34, 16 are in the energy, electric sector. We have 5 power generators, 11 distribution, 4 of the financial sector, and we also have enterprises in the defense sector, 3 of them, and the most important water company that supplies drinking water and sewage for Lima, post services, port services, and we have the only one in the world that trades leaves of coke, and also for 3 or 4 years we've had the supervision of the health service. And the 2 companies they own. FONAFE, through this holding and companies, has activity and presence at a national level. What I wanted to talk to you about, under a holding, FONAFE can issue guidelines and policies that must be mandatory for the enterprises under the regulation. I've just highlighted the most important ones. We should have explained a little bit more, but I wanted to talk about this corporate governance code. It's been approved since 2006. Then its implementation was not mandatory for all enterprises. They each divided the principles and implemented these depending on the perspective of each of the boards. But since the year 2013, a new code was approved. The previous one was revised and a new one was approved, and it's mandatory in terms of compliance for all companies. And we also have a mechanism to follow up on the level of implementation of the code, to measure if the companies implement actions that help them improve. We also have strategic subjects, budget, transparency. And I also wanted to tell you something else I wanted to talk to you about. This was related to corporate management. Under the holding, and when having several companies in the same sector, we can perform different activities in FONAFE. For instance, instance, corporate procurement, we have 11 power distribution companies, and the 11 of them perform the same role. It's just that one does it in the north of the country, another one in the center, and another one in the south of the country, each one in their concession areas. All of them buy wire, meters, transformers. So what we do is consolidate demand and to better have a large corporate procurement, trying to find efficiencies, standardization. And what we are trying to drive is synergies in the group. Even though maybe there was an energy sector company and another one from the health area, there may be best practices that can be shared among the companies. And that's what we are working on. And that's what we've done in the last 5 years when we developed our latest corporate strategic plan, and we've worked on this area. That's in general, talking about FONAFE. Now, talking about performance evaluation of companies, what I wanted to tell you is that I understand that we basically work on this based on the development of strategic plans. As we've said, we work based on guidelines issued by the board of FONAFE. That's mandatory for all companies, and these strategic plans are developed every 5 years. So all of the companies need to have a strategic plan in the same period. For instance, now we are reviewing the strategic plan 2017-2021. So all of these companies need to have a strategic plan for this period. And they should be strategic plans aligned to the strategic objectives of the sector they're in, but above all, to the corporation's strategic objectives for NAFES. So that way we align policies. And also, as part of these strategic plans, we consider indicators and targets for each indicator for the 5 years I've mentioned. After we have a strategic plan, of course, this is brought to the annual operating plan that is correlated to budget, that as I said, is approved by FONAFE's board. So actually, in practice, what happens is that FONAFE accompanies companies in the development of their strategic plans. First, we need to make sure that there is alignment. And secondly, we make sure that they use the same methodology we want all companies to use. So the strategic plans of all of our companies need to have objectives and indicators related to customers, processes, and learning. So for instance, all of the strategic plans and operating plans in FONAFE have a profitability indicator. It can be a ROE, EBITDA. That depends on the characteristics of each of the companies and on their own proposals. Also, as I said, since we have companies of the same sector, we also take advantage of these to measure enterprises using the same indicators. So, for instance, power distribution companies, all of the companies in our group will have an indicator measuring, for instance, energy losses, how long their power cutoffs, and this is measured by their indicators. So companies have clearly defined this, and this helps to develop a benchmark in the group and to compare ourselves to private enterprises that could do something similar in the Peruvian market. Now, how do we control compliance? Every quarter, companies need to present a report on the compliance of the operating and strategic plans. Then we use that information to verify if there is a difference or deviation from their goal that was approved, and if there is a 30% deviation approximately, what we do is to talk about our concern with the board, so they explain the reason for this deviation and for them to explain short-term actions to regain control of the objectives so that at the end of the year there is annual compliance. And also what we do is develop a report that we present to our board, and we rank compliance of strategic plans. And this is not public information, but we do give it to each of the companies, to each of the boards, and they can see their compliance level compared against the rest of the companies in the group. And what else can I say about this? There are some companies, as I've said, I've got 34. Some are more mature than others. One of our financial companies has been working on performance evaluation mechanisms, and this performance evaluation mechanism correlates to economic incentives, a bonus, and it's been implemented for 4 or 5 years. The idea is to try to copy this model for the rest of the companies. And something else I thought important to talk to you about that has been mentioned in the morning. In performance evaluation, we believe it's very important to evaluate performance of the boards. In the beginning of this year, the board of FONAFE approved the use of a methodology to evaluate performance of the board, and the methodology is also based on self-assessment. It's a self-assessment that directors do and the boards do all together. This is not to evaluate each of the directors of the company, so this is the first step. And the idea is to see how close the performance of the board is to best practices, and based on that, to identify the subjects that need to be developed in training for these boards and for these directors so they have a better performance. This is the first year we will do this, but in a subsequent meeting we can talk to you about the results. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Y gracias a todos los ponentes
Means
por
that
haber sido tan
we have
generosos
some
y
time, a bit of time for questions and answers, and I would, yes, just a word. It's easier for me if those who want to take the floor just put your flag like that. But Mr. Wan, you have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Wan Saiful from Malaysia. I have a question for two questions. One for Mr. Lafayette and Ms. Blas, another one for Mr. Anaya. It's really interesting when you mentioned about the evaluation of directors, of board members. And I was just wondering if you have any board members in your state-owned enterprises that are political appointees, and what happened to them if the evaluation is not really good. So that's number one. And number two, Mr. Anaya mentioned that the board members of PERMEX have to be approved by legislators. And I wonder how much politicization that actually incurs. Is there any politicization of the process?
Creo que les puedo contestar la experiencia en el caso de Perú para la primera pregunta.
In relation to Peru, to appoint directors in Peru, the power is on FONAFE's board, but actually the person is not appointed just for the fact of being a vice minister. I don't have any minister in any of my boards. I have vice ministers or some general directors working for ministries, but they are not appointed for the position. Actually, in Peru, there is a regulation that asks for a minimum profile. Maybe it's not the best. It needs to be adapted and improved, but it does help us to at least have professional directors, because what my profile asks for is for him to be professional and to have 5 years of management and or director experience. When this standard was published, it helped us a lot to be able to know, no, this person is not fit. No, but he is the general director. I'm sorry. He doesn't fulfill the profile. So that's the experience we've had in Peru. Si hay cierto nivel de politización.
Confirmed by the Senate. So the ministers of the Supreme Court, to start with, the board members for the equivalent of the FDIC, the banking, the equivalent of the FDIC, I don't know what you want to call it, the banking, not quite the regulator, but the insurance company. And one of those, among those packages, all ambassadors, etc. So it's interesting, your question is interesting because in the previous PEMEX reform, when there were also independent board members, the degree of politicization was much more than it was this time. So that's kind of working. I assume there was, like in many of these things, but a lot less than from your question than you would expect.
Okay. Yeah.
Con respecto a la primera pregunta,
Your first question, the result of the survey was what we asked. We didn't have a specific question related to what happens with directors that were not properly assessed, but there was a question that asked if this evaluation was part of the input in nomination processes, and it was not included. Why? Because most of the directors are not selected given the profile. These are only the independent directors that still are a minority in the enterprises we evaluated, precisely because in most of the enterprises, the director is appointed given his position at the ministry level or at a municipality level or at a government level. So since they have this position, they automatically become directors of these enterprises. So they don't necessarily have the adequate profile, but they also have this political position. And what happens if they are not well evaluated? Well, we don't do it because we don't ask about it.
Bueno, entonces ya tenemos una pregunta para el señor Parker. It is a question, and you were presenting during the very interesting information that you just shared that there's a directory committee on FONAFE's management. I'd like to know how this directory is formed and if the functional ministries have any incidence on companies' management, at least according to the definition of your strategic plans or the indicators based on which FONAFE's management happens. Well, FONAFE's management, FONAFE's directory, which is formed by the ministries, as I told you, have a series of abilities, of skills. So there are decisions that they can only make. For example, assigning directories, approval of budgeting, modifying organizational structures within the company. Those are some skills that they have, the directories have. And I am the executive director, which is like a general management, and I have to report to that directory. So I receive a series of requests by the companies. I have to go to the directory so that they solve them or approve or deny demands, because there's a series of skills that this directory has. Now, what is the influence that the ministries can have in terms of directories that our companies manage? I cannot say directly, but as I was saying, the strategic plans on the companies need to be aligned to the strategic objectives by sectors. So definitely they should follow a series of indicators that have to be aligned with sectorial goals or objectives. So the companies also have to discuss this logic with their business function, and it should not be blended with the public policy's objectives. We have to look after this within the companies. They know about it. So there are indicators that are related. For example, in the power sector, the power ministry is interested in having an efficient usage of energy and power so that with the operative efficiency we can provide power to more Peruvians. So it's something that's only related to the loss of energy. So this is an indicator that's still aligned to the business logic, actually.
Okay, I give the floor to Antonio.
Entonces, bueno, vamos a dar la conclusión. Sí, muchas gracias. Quisiera...
Yeah, learning from your presentation of the corporate governance toolkit, I learned that actually from the chapters, there is no specific chapter on risk management. Whereas I learned that when we are developing a course syllabus with the IFC on the risk governance, we learned that there is a lot of needs, and the board of directors needs to know the accountability in executing the risk management. So may I know whether this is going to be one separate chapter, or this is going to be just a part of your existing chapters?
Thank you. It's actually part of the chapter on the board of directors. So when you look into the board of directors as part of the audit and or risk committee, but you're right, there is no separate standalone discussion on risk governance. And in fact, we had done this toolkit now, started it a couple of years ago. So the toolkit then was just intended to set out the broad framework and the broad ideas, and now as the second phase of the reform, spinning off from the toolkit, we are going much more into more specific topics in greater detail and fleshing them out, because we're seeing that as the broad understanding is there and broad concepts have already been digested, really now when it comes down to implementation and down to the more concrete specific details, there are certain topic areas that are emerging much more deeply. So we'll be looking at those kinds of issues in greater depth, especially when it comes to the financial institutions governance. And in fact, as part of the governance of financial institutions, there's always a standalone section on risk governance.
Okay, thank you. We have two more demands for the floor. In the interest of timekeeping, I will take them and then I'll try to wrap this up. The first is Alejandro Diaz.
Gracias, Hans. Lo mío es muy breve.
Brief clarification on what Andres prepared in Argentina's case, which was of the company that has responded. So I wanted to clarify that we are considered public officers, those who are directors of state-owned companies. It is not that they accumulate positions. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to have to talk about the topic, actually, and I'm going to deepen because it is very complex. But I wanted to clarify because maybe there could be some confusion in terms of the results of the regulation. Now, my question is for Patricia, and it is related to the FONAFE's operations and functioning. You have a sort of you are a sort of intermediate person when trying the public policies designed by officers is adequate to the strategic plans of the companies, or the other way around. Better said, the strategic plans of the company should be adapted to the strategic plan of the country in terms of those activities or sectors, right? Is that the way it works? Well, yes. I mean, we cannot neglect that companies are part of a sector. They are public companies at the end of the day. So what we look for is for an aligning with the strategic objective per sectors. I mean, before the approval of FONAFE's directory, the strategic plans are proposed by the company's directories, but they are approved by FONAFE's directory, and before this, they need to have a revision by the sector, right? And they also need to be assessed by FONAFE's management. So with these two elements, we can go to FONAFE's directory and propose the approval. And truth be told, if we as a management are not satisfied, then we ask for it to be revised and changed so we can bring it before the FONAFE's directory once again. Bueno, creo que hay otra pregunta más, pero por ahora le pido a Juan Morquiera que por favor haga su pregunta. Perdón, el micrófono, por favor, recuerde prender el micrófono. So you were saying that in the group of companies you have 4 financial entities, right? So my question is, if in the case of these financial entities, are there specific requirements by the corporate governance when financing companies, specifically when these are part of the rest of the Peruvian public sector? Now, why am I asking this? Because all of the financial entities are subjected to Basile's requirements, liquidity, cash flow, etc. So my question is, are there specific requirements for public financial entities in order to fund the rest of Peruvian public companies? Ow! Now the rest of the participants is going to have a group of work on the corporate for the financial and the intermediates, where the OECD is going to have an important role, where they're going to try to discuss specific requirements for the corporate government that differentiate the nature of the financial entities in terms of the rest of the companies that are in the stock market. Let me see if I understood the question. So what you said is that you wanted to know if there is a requirement so that the financial public companies meet when financing the rest of the non-financial companies? No, the public companies. Well, the thing is that our public companies do not finance. I mean, our companies, I have financial and non-financial companies. That's the way we call them. So I told you that 4 of them are financials, and yes, each of them have, for example, Agrobanco, Cofil, so they have a role. Agrobanco can only destine their funding so they can lend small and medium agriculture companies. So FIDE is in terms of concessions, financing for small and medium companies, and the companies, the non-financial companies, do not receive any financing from my financial institutions because, as I was saying, for better or for worse, we have a procedure. The companies, the non-financial companies, if they want to capture resources, maybe a loan, they have to go through a pre-approval by the economic ministry. If the economic ministry does not approve that financing, that funding, then they cannot capture financial resources. So this is relatively restricted in the country. My non-financial companies are funded by the reinvestment of their profit, and basically that's it, or some money that we could provide as owners. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, yo sugiero que entonces tomemos estas 2 preguntas y después ya cerremos. Perdón, pero ya no puedo tomar más preguntas por el tiempo. Jorge. Muchas gracias, Hans. Entonces voy a hacer una pregunta en español porque es para Pepe Toño. And Andres, as General Director of Pemex, you already met with independent councillors under a new regime where you integrate committees. So as a general position and according to your view, facing the Management Council, most of the committees has provided valuable information. And in your case, how much do you think that the size or the possible imposition of Pemex's size compared to the national economy can influence the participation of these independent advisors? This goes a little bit related to Andres' presentation on the evaluation of the performance of these independent advisors. So then, Andres, if it is included in the survey, a sort of indicator or performance measurement in terms of the advisors that are because of their expertise and not because they were appointed as public officers. So how have they contributed in terms of the council or towards the general advisors in order to provide valuable information to make processes better? Perdón, antes de volver a los panelistas.
Thank you very much. My question to Ms. Patricia is concerning the reviewing of the plan for the public enterprises. I wanted to find out in case of the, for NAFE, if they review the objectives and the strategic objective of that particular public enterprises, who is accountable in terms of the implementation after reporting? Because there have been cases around the world, especially in Africa, where the entities like acting like for NAFE try to change the plans of the particular public enterprises, and then the public enterprise does not implement. So I wanted to ask clarity, and based on what review do they change the plans or in terms of the strategy of the public enterprises? Is it based on the mandate, or is just how FONAFE feel that no, the public enterprise is supposed to implement in a particular way? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. González-Anaya, do you want to answer?
Sí, el papel de los
Independent advisors within committees has been very important. In the audit committee, we only have independent advisors. We don't have any government advisor. And in the rest of the committees, each of them is presided by an independent advisor. So this has worked very well. The system has worked very well. Each of the independent advisors has a committee that they are in charge of. Any of the advisors can attend to any of the committees, but to the audit ones, they are the only ones allowed. So this has worked very well. Muchas gracias, Andrés.
Y lamentablemente no tengo una respuesta a tu pregunta.
An answer to your question, Jorge, because there was a very ambitious survey in terms of addressing several topics, but this one was not one of them. And we didn't want to stun our potential companies with too many questions. So in order not to bombard them with questions and for it to be friendly, we tried to reduce the number of questions. So this is one of those who we would have wanted to ask, but since we wanted for it to be simple and we reduced it, and maybe the results will allow us to think in a second investigation so we can ask further questions that go deep on thoughts that remain in our heads. So this maybe could be part of a second study, so thank you. Sí, por favor.
Sí, a ver, el proceso plan estratégico.
Well, the strategic process in Peru through FONAFE indicates that each 5 years we need to go over this revision. As I told you before, the strategic plan, the strategic objectives have to be aligned to the strategic objectives by sectors and FONAFE's strategic objectives. And these, at the end of the day, are the strategic plans that are approved by FONAFE's directory. So what can be done in this 5-year period? Well, companies, through their own directories, can review it, because there could always be some external variables that could change goals, some indicators, and it could even change the strategic objectives. But if the company believes that they have to change a strategic objective that could end up turning the general approved strategy, then it has to go once again to FONAFE's directory. And I think that with this, we always try to be aligned so that no company can, so to speak, run away or get away with a political issue. So that's the way the process works, more or less. It proposes strategic objectives and a revision in FONAFE's case. Muy bien, muchas gracias por este intercambio.
Overall, in a sensible way, but just a final observation from me. We have focused on two main topics. One is top-down evaluation of performance, and the other is the functioning of SOE boards of directors. Now, if I place myself in the middle of the logics of the OECD guidelines, I would say that the challenge then becomes how to make a stringent and meaningful performance evaluation without getting so much into the nitty-gritty and the details that you effectively infringe on the autonomy of the boards of directors of the companies. And with this observation, I think we will call a break, a short break of about 10 minutes, and then we'll reconvene. Thank you very much.